Parasect's mushroom is one of the most common examples of a parasite in the Pokemon world, but you know, this isn't the only case where a parasite feeds off of another Pokemon. And that's what we'll be discussing today. Not alone though, as we'll actually be joined by Amazed Dragon, someone who specializes in Pokemon theories here on YouTube.
Hey, glad to be here. When Fox of Virtue showed me the whole parasite concept he's been working on, I couldn't help but ask to get involved somewhat, so, you know, that's why I'm here. With that in mind, there's something regarding Parasect I'd like to try and answer. What Pokemon would the crab have evolved into if it hadn't been infected at birth? Take a look at Parasect. A massive mushroom sprouts from its back, and underneath you can see its two murky white eyes staring back at us. Ugh. Now take a look at Cloth. Not only is it too a crab, but its body shape also has an eerily similar structure to that of Parasect. However, compared to Parasect, Cloth's eyes aren't murky, which makes sense given that the reason Parasects are is due to the crab being, well, dead. But if these two Pokemon truly are related, then why does Cloth have a tough and hardened rock-like carapace in the place where the mushroom should be sprouting from? Well, I think there are two very good possibilities here. The first is that stronger Cloth were able to fight this infection off. That would also help explain why Cloth have a much higher base stat total and even possess abilities such as Shell Armor and Regenerator. The second possibility is that the Cloth that we see around us just weren't part of the batch that were infected in the first place.
You know what, I think both of these possibilities might not actually be that far off. Like whilst reading into Parasect, I found out that their Alolan Dex entry mentions that apparently their mushrooms don't grow as well in arid and nutrient deprived regions. Now compare that to the only area in which we're able to find Cloth, Paldea's South Province area 3. Not only does this mountainous cliffside definitely meet those exact criteria, but it's also one of the few areas in Paldea where you cannot obtain either the tiny or big mushrooms. This in our case is relevant because knowing that wild Paras and Parasect are often found holding onto these items, it's likely that they're at least somewhat related to the mushrooms growing on Paras's and Parasect's backs. Then there's also the fact that both Paras and Parasect physically cannot be obtained in either Scarlet or Violet. So if that's the case, then why can we still find tiny and big mushrooms elsewhere in Paldea? Well, I think Parasect once very well could have lived in Paldea, but similar to what you said, Amazed Dragon, eventually a group of them that weren't fully infected yet grew to resist the mushroom. And this is mostly coming off of the fact that Parasect's mushroom is actually based on the zombie ant fungi. This parasite, similar to what we see happen with Parasect, infects ants and begins controlling their body. However, what's interesting about this particular example is that ants who haven't yet been infected actually begin avoiding the areas in which ants have died as a result of this mushroom. In a way, they are actively trying to avoid these so-called graveyards. So what if the Parasect that once lived in Paldea did exactly that? If so, they would have eventually moved away from the regions that benefited the mushrooms the most, and ultimately could have very well ended up in South Province Area 3. Okay, so this next Pokemon I found to be rather interesting. According to one of Clamperl's Pokédex entries, it can only ever make a single pearl in its lifetime, a pearl said to form only after it has evolved. But that's also somewhat confusing, because we don't actually know of a Pokemon that evolves into Clamperl. So what Pokemon could that be? Well, I think there's a good chance of it being Shelder. I mean, aside from their clearly similar design, both Shelder and Clamperl are each able to make their own pearls. And not only that, but according to another one of Clamperl's Pokédex entries, its pearl is said to be 10 times more valuable than Shelder's. Something which would make sense if Clamperl is the stronger evolved form of Shelder. But what I found most strange about all of this is the way these two Pokemon actually make their pearls. Like, from what we know about Shelder, for example, is that it specifically forms its pearls using collected grains of sand. However, nothing is said about how Clamperl makes its pearls. Obviously, if Shelder can evolve into Clamperl, this process might very well make their pearls more valuable. But I think there's actually a more reasonable explanation for this. Because interestingly enough, in real life, pearls naturally forming around grains of sand is very unlikely to happen. I mean, typically, most clams create them more as a method of defense during times bacteria manage to slip by their rock-hard shells. So taking this into consideration, what if the Shelder which formed their pearls using bacteria actually turned into Clamperl? That would also help explain why Clamperl's pearl actually has a face on it.
You know, now that you mention it, Clamperl doesn't even seem to benefit from this pearl at all, because if it truly were meant to help Clamperl, you'd expect it to show somewhere in its typing or move pool. Yet Clamperl remains a pure water type, and on top of that, the only psychic type move it can learn is Rest. Now, while this might make it seem like the bacteria inside the pearl isn't directly harming Clamperl, I actually do think it does. I mean, sticking with the whole parasite concept, what's if the reason Clamperl isn't a psychic type Pokemon is because the bacteria stole that energy? Considering what you've said before, Fox of Virtue, the stuff about Shelder's relation to Clamperl, wouldn't the fact that Shelder being known to latch onto tails of Slowpoke and feeding off of them mean that they also gain some of Slowpoke's psychic energy through this process? That would leave us with the possibility that it's the very energy that the bacteria eventually steal from Shelder after causing them to evolve into Clamperl. All this could actually help explain why we're also able to find Clamperl's pearl on top of the head of Spoink, because one question that has never really been answered is how the pearl even gets there in the first place. For that, I want to take a look at Clamperl's Photodex entry in the new Pokemon Snap. According to this, they sometimes catch a ride from Driftblim when they want to move. So, unless Clamperl somehow works with Driftblim in some other way, I believe the most likely scenario is that it's actually the bacteria which uses the energy it drains from Clamperl to lure in Driftblim and help them reach Spoink. And seeing how we find Clamperl in a state where it obviously no longer has any psychic power left to feed the bacteria inside of it, then maybe the reason any of this even happens is because the bacteria is ultimately searching for a new food source. It searches for Spoink as a new source of psychic energy.
Maze Dragon, since you were actually the one that brought up this next Pokemon, how about you introduce the concept for us this time? Because the idea here is pretty unsettling. What if the flower Eternal Flower Floette holds is actually a parasite?
Well, according to one of Flabebe's Pokédex entries, when they search for a flower they like, it's usually depending on its color and shape. And before they even find one, they are said to be almost completely defenseless, to the point where another entry essentially describes their flowers as becoming a part of their body. So in most cases, traditional Flabebe essentially work alongside their flowers. Now let's compare that to Eternal Flower Floette. Doesn't something feel off? Because strangely enough, according to one of its own Pokédex entries, a terrifying energy is kept within this flower. Now, for those that did play Pokemon Legend CA, we know that this energy is most likely shown to us in the form of both its signature move, Light of Ruin, and its Mega Evolution. But in this case, I want to take a closer look at its Mega Evolution, because it too has a dex entry in which it states the following. The Eternal Flower has absorbed all the energy from Mega Evolution. The flower now attacks enemies on its own. Notice how it doesn't say Floette attacks its enemies, it specifically says the flower does. And seeing how after Mega Evolution, the flower itself is plugged into Floette, doesn't it seem like the flower is siphoning off of Floette, siphoning its energy? And considering all of this, could it be that the flower that Eternal Floette carries is the reason for why it cannot evolve outside of Mega Evolution? Could it be that this flower is the reason and not the light from the ultimate weapon?
You know, speaking of which, Floette not having the ability to evolve is something that even AZ doesn't entirely know much about. To the point where he only guesses it's because of the life energy poured into Floette during its revival. What I also found to be quite interesting is that despite the flower essentially taking over Floette, we still see it retaining some control. Because during the moment Tawny or Urbane are trapped within Hyper Rogue on Floette, they specifically tell us that Floette is still protecting them. This makes me think that if the flower truly is acting like a parasite, then it's more so just continuously draining Floette of its energy. And that possibly even before Floette's revival, the flower was already preventing Floette from evolving. Because if we actually look at the war from 3000 years ago where Floette ultimately ended up passing away, it's not only one of the few Pokemon that for some reason remains unevolved, but it's clearly also using Light of Ruin, the move which we now know might actually be usable because the flower is draining Floette of its energy. You know when a game says one thing, but when you take a second to think about it, what you just heard doesn't make any sense at all? Well, the goal of this channel is to take those unexplained ideas and by looking at them through a more realistic lens, try to prove them right. Now, I can't always guarantee we'll reach a reasonable conclusion, but if this does sound like something you would enjoy and you want to help grow this channel, consider subscribing and leaving a like. I also always appreciate any sort of feedback, so feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. You know, I first didn't really think much of this next Pokemon, but now looking back at Rabsca again, it's actually pretty interesting, because supposedly the ball which it carries contains an infant Pokemon. The thing I'm curious about is what exactly is that Pokemon? I mean, one thing unique to Rabsca is that it's one of the only 2 Pokemon that can use the move Revival Blessing. In the case of the other Pokemon Pommet, seeing how it can use its paws almost like defibrillators, a move which revives a fainted Pokemon kind of makes sense for it to know. Yet Rabsca doesn't have any of those features, so why can it use this move? Well, I think this has to do with Rabsca's connection to the infant Pokemon. Because if we look at what Rabsca is actually based on, scarab beetles, or more specifically the Egyptian scarab-faced god Khepri, we find that this god represents the rising sun and by extension creation and renewal of life. So knowing that, wouldn't it make sense that when Rabsca uses Revival Blessing, it's sort of mimicking this same renewal of life? Only that in this case, unlike a god, Rabsca can't just simply create energy for this move out of thin air. And this is actually where I first thought about the Parasite concept, because one of the reasons Rabsca can use Revival Blessing is actually because it's draining the infant of its energy.
You know, that doesn't actually sound all that far-fetched, because, now this might sound a little strange at first, but what if I were to tell you that there's a good chance that the infant that Rabsca carries is actually a Volcarona? Take a look at Rabsca's forehead. This white star closely resembles an urna, which in Buddhist culture is said to represent a shining light. Combine that with what you said previously, Fox of Virtue, about Rabsca being based on the Egyptian god Khepri, it would make sense for Volcarona, otherwise known as the Sun Pokemon, to be somehow related to this. And you know, I think this relation becomes especially interesting when you consider that Larvesta and Volcarona also seem to be inspired by immortal phoenixes. Phoenixes, which in our case might be how Revival Blessing keeps Rabsca alive and provides them with an almost infinite source of energy. Of course, this still leaves the question as to how Rabsca even got to the point of carrying an infant Larvesta above its head. But I think I might actually have an answer to that, because according to a Pokédex entry from Rabsca's pre-evolution, Reller, it doesn't just get born with this ball of mud, but rather purposefully makes it. Considering that Reller are also specifically based on dung beetles, a subspecies of scarab beetles that raise their larvae in these balls of mud, Reller would likely do something similar. Only that in our case, they might be raising maturing Larvesta instead.
Whilst looking into the Parasite topic, one of the Pokemon that stood out to me was Galarian Corsola, because according to their Dex entries, they're apparently considered to be a species of Corsola that died out when sudden climatic changes affected their environment. The question I have with this is, why did this result in a new regional form and not the death of this species? I mean, take fossil Pokemon for example, they too died out a long time ago, yet they didn't receive a regional form. Of course, we also know that something similar happened with Hisui and Zora. Well, only that in this case, the Zorua are said to have perished because humans forced them to migrate to the harsh Hisuian environment. Now, the reason I'm even bringing up Hisui and Zora in the first place is because, interestingly enough, unlike Hisui and Zorua, Galarian Corsola is distinct from its other regional form, in that it has its own separate evolution. But why is that? Well, I believe that it has to do with a parasite which is preventing traditional Corsola from evolving. Like, if we compare Corsola to real-life corals, it's likely that they too are made up of plankton and smaller creatures called polyps. And such, Corsola would also rely on the plankton's ability to make food using sunlight to then share it with the polyps. Comparing this to Galarian Corsola, we find out that they're based on bleached corals. And the reason this matters is that in bleached corals, polyps no longer work alongside the plankton. Basically, when corals are under environmental stress, their plankton will begin sharing less food with them. And as a result, the polyps see them more as a parasite and eventually expel parts of the body in which they live. Now, knowing all that, if Galarian Corsola represents corals where only the polyps remain, what if what's preventing Corsola from evolving is actually their own plankton?
Mind if I jump in here real quick? I think what you said might honestly not be that far off, because interestingly enough, Galarian Corsola only evolve into Corsola once they have absorbed other Pokemon for so long that spirit energy breaks open their shells and pours out of them. Comparing this to regular Corsola, doesn't it seem like the reason they can never reach this amount of energy is because they're forced to share it with their plankton? But that still leaves the question of what regular Corsola would evolve into if they didn't need to share that energy. In order to answer this, I'd like us to take a look at the specific types of coral Corsola are actually based on, that being stony corals. Now, while Galarian Corsola are based on those same corals, their evolution, Corsola, is actually inspired by a specific suborder collectively known as Gorgonian corals. On one hand, seeing how Corsola are able to petrify their prey, this likely refers to Gorgons from Greek mythology. But more importantly, this type of coral is actually considered to be a soft coral, which is interesting because stony and soft corals are the two main groups in which corals are classified under. So, knowing that, I actually believe regular Corsola could very well evolve into something similar to Corsola, only that in this case their evolutions might show them working more effectively with their plankton, rather than living entirely without them.
I want to give a big thanks to Amazed Dragon for joining me on this video. If you're into Pokemon lore and want to see some really well thought out theories, I highly recommend you check out some of his videos. Well, I think that pretty much wraps it up. Thanks for watching.